This module is on Asian American racial identity development. An overview of this theory. The Asian American racial identity development theory has been changed to reflect a focus on theory rather than racial or ethnic development. The theory used to be called Asian American Identity Development Theory. The name of the theory has been changed because it discussed racial identity, which is more of a subject of oppression and racism than it is of ethnicity. An overview of this theory, the Asian American racial identity development model, is as follows. It's racial versus ethnic, like I mentioned. It addresses resolving racial identity and racial conflict while also at the same time growing up in a white-dominated society. It's more applicable to children growing up in white-dominated society versus people who immigrate as teens or adults, and it was developed in 2001 by Kim. The 5 stages of Asian American racial identity development theory describes the path to developing a positive racial identity while kind of at the same time living in a society where they receive negative messages and stereotypes for their race. The theory is described by 5 stages. The 5 stages are listed here on the slide. While the theory is not necessarily linear, the progression through the stages is sequential and is very dependent on the social environment. As a person progresses through the stages, their perception of their place in the racial group and the dominant group become more defined. People may become stuck in a stage and never progress, or they may progress through all of the stages. And in any stage of life, people may revisit stages that they have already previously progressed through. The 5 stages are listed on the slide and are as follows: ethnic awareness, white identification, awakening to social political consciousness, redirection to an Asian American consciousness, and incorporation. Each of these will be described in further detail. Stage 1 of the Asian American racial identity development theory is ethnic awareness. This stage lasts from birth until entering the school system, and it usually changes when they enter the school system because this is the first time that their social environment will change. In the first stage, ethnic awareness is influenced by interactions with family members, relatives, and those in their community. If their community is dominated by people of Asian ethnicity, the person will develop a much more positive sense of self, a much more positive ego identity, and a positive ethnic awareness, much more so than those who live in communities with a smaller Asian population. So, membership with large Asian communities give them a sense of security, positive ethnic awareness and ethnic pride, positive self-concept, and clearer ego identity than those do not have as much as exposure to Asian communities. Stage 2 is known as white identification. This period of life usually begins when they enter the school system. This is because suddenly their social environment is drastically different. This changes their self-concept from positive to that of maybe neutral or even negative. It's marked by a strong sense of feeling different from peers. And that's from negative experiences such as getting picked on or made fun of just for being different. Being made fun of, for instance. The message that a person receives is that they're different and that this is bad, or they're made to feel inferior. Because of their cultural values, like quiet suffering and avoidance of shame, a person will try to fit in to the environment to avoid any kind of public embarrassment. In doing so, they'll actually gradually internalize dominant white societal values. And that can alienate any Asian community members. And they'll also tend to deny social injustice, racism, and discrimination in just the attempt to fit in. Active white identification versus passive white identification. So active white identification is usually experienced by those who grew up in white-dominated communities. In this, Asian Americans consider themselves very similar to white peers and try to minimize any Asian features, physically, or dietary preferences. In passive white identification, it's typically experienced by Asian Americans who grew up in large Asian communities. The person does not distance themselves from other Asians. However, they may at times wish to be white. They also accept white values and white beliefs. In this period, in this stage, there's a huge focus on excelling academically and leadership roles in schools and organizations. Stage 3 is awakening to a social and political consciousness. In stage 3, a transformation of a person's self image occurs due to increased understanding of the social and political structure. The Asian American person no longer tries to fit in or strives to be like white people. There's a big transformation of how they see themselves and how they understand the political process. This is because they are aware of racism and societal barriers that exist, and they understand that they are not responsible for this racism or discrimination or negative racial encounters that they have experienced. The result is kind of this release of guilt and inferiority just for being Asian. So there's a shift in personal responsibility to social responsibility. So they're aware of white racism. They're no longer blame themselves for negative racial experiences that have happened to them. Like I said, there's a release of guilt and this feeling of inferiority just based on their race. And there's a realization of societal structures and barriers that are placed upon them. The reaction against white people, they no longer use whites as the dominant or as the reference group. They no longer want to be like white people. Stage 4 is redirection to an Asian American consciousness. As stage 4 begins, one begins to connect with and explore their Asian heritage. This is done by looking at the history and culture of Asian American backgrounds. As the foundation is laid, Asian Americans begin to feel more confident in their own identity. The process brings anger and resentment before having peace and pride as to who they really are. Towards the end of stage 4, one's identity emerges as pride in realizing that they are multicultural as both Asians and as Americans. Stage 5 is known as incorporation. Incorporation is when one has reached the highest level of confidence in their Asian American multicultural identity, and then they start to incorporate this into their lives. Realizing that their own identity is important, but also so is the respect for culture and heritage of others, so they're no longer going to tolerate kind of the put-downs that they were in stage 1. The Asian American person no longer needs to be with only other Asian American communities, but they're now also willing to interact with others outside of their race. In order to make this theory a little more applicable, we went ahead and did an Asian American student interview. She discusses the intricacies of being multiracial. She considers herself Asian American as well as Middle Eastern. She discusses her interpretation of her race and the ways in which it has influenced her identity as a multiracial woman. She discusses the ways in which she may have altered her identity around differing groups and how belonging to a few ethnic groups has certainly altered her self-perception. Lastly, the student discusses her perception of the benefits and disadvantages she perceives due to her Asian identity. As you're watching the video, try to determine for yourself what stage, which one of the 5 stages mentioned previously, that you think she may be in. Listen for cues on social awareness. Listen for cues on acceptance of culture and heritage or disassociation from the culture or heritage of an Asian American. Also, listen to her either deny or embrace her Asian American culture. Feel free to click the link and watch the video. The strengths and contributions of Asian Americans in the U.S. There's low divorce rates, and extended family households demonstrate an emphasis on family and unity. They also indicate strengths in interpersonal relationships and loyalty. In addition, this results in a strong built-in social support system for many Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Lee Siegel of the Wall Street Journal is quoted as saying, "Asian Americans are now the country's best educated, highest earning, and fastest growing racial group. They share with American Jews both the distinction and the occasional burden of immigrant success." This is based on the following data from the U.S. Census Bureau. According to that census, there's strength in income. 72,689 is the median income of households headed by Asians alone or in combination population in 2014. The median household income differed greatly by Asian group. For Asian Indians, for example, the median income in 2014 was 101,591. For Bangladeshi, it was 44,512. There's also strength in attaining a higher education. According to that same census, 50.6 is the percentage of Asians alone or in combination that are 25 or older with a bachelor's degree or higher. This is compared with 30.1% of all Americans 25 or older. So they're a good 20% higher than the American average. Strength in numbers in postgraduate or professional degrees. The percentage according to that census in 2014 was 21.2%. That's 25 or older Asians alone or in combination with population that have a graduate degree or a professional degree. This is compared with only 11.4% of all Americans 25 or older. So same, it's kind of double the amount. This is just a visual representation of the statistics that we're talking about. These are from 2010. So you'll see in the first graph there, Asian Americans are 49% are considerably higher than all other ethnic groups, including all of the U.S. put together, as far as bachelor's degrees or higher for ages 25 and older. Also under that, you'll see the median U.S. household income in 2010. Again, Asian Americans are considerably higher than all other groups at $66,000, especially when compared to that of all U.S. Family households. There's also very high strength in job occupancy. Here you'll see 49.5% of Asian Americans 16 or older who work in management, business, science, and art occupations 2014. You can kind of read beneath that, 20.7% are in sales and office occupations, 17.2 are in service occupations, 9.4 work in production, transportation, and material moving occupations, and 3.2 work in natural resources, construction, and maintenance occupations. The criticisms of this theory kind of are as follows. They make a lot of assumptions. It assumes that racism is pervasive and that it happens everywhere and happens all the time. It's shedding negative identity associations requires concerted effort, whereas this theory kind of makes it seem like it's something that just naturally happens. It really does take attention and awareness. In order to accomplish a positive identity development, past negative events must be reframed. So it's not just recreating your sense of self, but it's also kind of reframing the way that you've been treated or the way that you've been put down because of your race. And that also takes kind of focused attention. The theory also assumes that awakening to a social political consciousness. So the theory kind of asserts that an individual will just become socially aware of the politics surrounding their ethnicity. Furthermore, this theory does not necessarily fully account for the vast diversity within Asia itself. A student from Japan is going to perceive and react and interact with this kind of theory completely different than an Indian student or a Thai student. Furthermore, it does not necessarily address generational differences, both living in the U.S. and as a college student. It doesn't necessarily answer, what about like the interracial and interethnic Asian American students? Furthermore, is this theory applicable to Asian international students? We did make reference to the idea that this theory definitely applies more to a student who is raised here versus someone who moved here when they were a teen or an adult, but it doesn't actually fully answer that question. And lastly, this theory does not show that people could go through these stages at multiple times in their life, and when these stages necessarily happen. Here are some of the resources that we use, and so if you'd like to pursue any more information or you'd like to do a little more digging, please feel free to do so. The following are the class discussion topics for this week. The first one is, what does it mean to be Asian? And we want you to talk about Eastern thought and Western thought on what it actually means to be Asian. The second question is, what limitations do you see emerging from this theory? We touched on them a little bit, but what others do you notice? The third is, how do you feel about the challenges uniquely faced by our Asian American students? And lastly, how can we, as SAHI professionals, use awareness of this theory to be better equipped to benefit our Asian American students?